When you talk about, the one side, the revenue side, you also need to talk about the cost side. And so when we talk about hospital expenses, what ends up happening is that labor tends to account for a bulk of it. Food and housing are a relatively small part of the expenses. If you've been to most hospitals, especially the older ones, you see the food options are not very good because what hospitals' goal is to promote the patient getting better, and so the emphasis is on care. Now, if we look at back here, all right, so we have labor accounting for 53%. Professional fees, which I'll discuss in a minute, account for 5%. Supplies, depreciation, and interest. Okay. But you can see that labor, which is a large part, this 53%, 5% professional fees, that does make up a bulk of it. Now, what are those professional fees? So, many physicians in hospitals actually do not work for the hospitals. They have their own office, they have their own practice, and then they come into the hospital to do you can call it consulting type work. So what happens is in small hospitals, or a lot of hospitals, especially small ones, is they don't need a full-time cardiologist on staff. Okay. They're not doing too many heart procedures in most hospitals. And so if they were to employ one for a full-time, a lot of it would be a waste of money because they wouldn't be able to, or they'd be paying them that person to work, 40, 50, 60, 70 hours a week, when in reality they only needed him or her for, let's say, 10 hours a week on average. So what happens is they contract in a lot of different specialists to do and see patients as need be, and like I said, they have their other job on the side. But what ends up happening, though, is by doing that, they're able to cover a lot of different specialties that way. Now, these doctors, they get paid those professional fees. It's not the case with all doctors. There are some physicians that are covered by salary that work only for the hospital, or almost all fully for the hospital. And that's going to be things where there is constant need for them. And so, for example, emergency room doctors, okay? Pediatric doctors. And the other thing to know is that this is not the case with all hospitals. And so, for example, some hospitals have dedicated, or they're one of the best lung hospitals in the country. And so they're going to have doctors that focus on that area there full time to do research, to see patients. But what ends up happening is that a bulk of the labor costs are for your, and I use this term lightly, very, very lightly, less skilled staff. Okay? Again, I use that term very, very lightly. That's going to be your nurses, your clerical staff, security, and all that. Now, if you've ever been to a hospital and you've had to stay overnight, you'll see that it's very, very seldom that you actually see the doctors. You have nurses there all the time. There's always a nurse nearby. But with a lot of cases, you might only see a doctor 1 or 2 times a day, even in a small hospital, whereas the nurses are always there. And that's why, because the doctors typically aren't on the premises. They're out and they come in at certain times of the day. So another area of labor costs is the cost of employing people to run the machines, the x-ray techs, right, people doing the blood work. And so those machines, they are high cost, but the cost of actually running them can be much, much higher. So again, that all goes into labor costs. When it comes to a hospital budget, a lot of the fees, the expenses, they're set in advance, and so cost cutting becomes very, very difficult in the hospital, especially in the short run. Now, overall with the hospital, in order for it to stay in business, not declare bankruptcy, the total revenue, the money that it brings in, must be greater than the total cost, the money it sends out and spends. However, it's not the case with each patient. There may be some patients where they're making a profit on, other patients they're taking a loss on. And so, in most hospitals, in fact, that's rarely the case where they're making a profit or almost breaking even on every patient. And this comes down to the idea of your people who are uninsured, who come in, or they come in with bad insurance, and their insurance will cover a lot. And so what happens is these patients without insurance, who tend to be lower income and can't afford the bills, they are not able to pay, and so the hospital doesn't charge them as much, or they don't recoup as much from them at least. And they need to make up the money somewhere. Again, those total revenues have to be greater than total costs. And so what do? This is again going back to the difference between charges and cost reimbursement. They charge more to the patients with insurance. And this is a very common practice. They charge people who have insurance more than people who don't have insurance. They also shift philanthropy and grants to care for low-income individuals as well. And all this is it's common and accepted practice. Now, another area where they can actually overcharge versus undercharge is with procedure type. With certain high-cost procedures, the people who are getting them are mostly the people with insurance. Right? So let's say someone getting a $200,000 procedure, right? They're covered a lot of times with insurance. And with those, the hospitals have tended to overcharge for them because they know that in most cases, the patient, they have a deductible, they have a certain amount they have to pay. After that amount, the hospital is going to kick in and cover most of the rest of it. And when that happens, it's a way for them to charge more because the hospital is going to be covering it, because it's not something you have to worry about the patient being willing to pay for or not. Now, you might think, well, wait a second, why don't hospitals push back on that? The reason why is that, or not hospitals, why don't the insurance companies push back on that? And the reason why they don't push back on that is, okay, well, why would they want to? If it's happening with all insurance companies, what does that mean? That means that all insurance companies have to pay. And so, as healthcare costs have gone up, as the premiums have gone up, the insurance companies have said, all right, that's fine, let them go. All right, we still get our percentage of profits, and if let's say their profit margin is 5%, and so 5% of 100 million is less than 5% of 120 million. And so they're okay letting these go on. They're okay letting these higher costs as long as it's being applied across the board, because then everyone gets more profits with that. Now, when it comes to hospitals, like any other business, they have to compete. And in general, the greater the number of patients that come in, the greater the revenue comes in. Now, quality is the most important aspect of competition, but in general, there's 3 ways that hospitals compete. The first way they compete is by competing for patients. Now, that competition, it can be a little bit tough at times because there's times when patients don't have a choice. So the patients that they actually treat for is going to be the ones who have a decision on where to go, and they're also going to be able to compete on money that ends up being taken out of their pockets, those types of patients. For example, with emergency, this is in contrast to emergency patients, which a lot of times are going to go to the closest ones that they can find. So the way that hospitals attempt to compete on patients is based on the quality of care and the prices. All right, some combination. What has been shown, however, and this may be surprising, is that patients are not very responsive to that, likely because of insurance. What patients tend to be more responsive in choosing a new hospital is the surroundings and the food, as opposed to effectiveness and quality and qualifications. So that might seem a little crazy. Patients are more concerned with getting a good view and seeing some nice artwork than they are about the quality of care. But it's actually been the case, and studies have shown this. So what has happened, and if you've seen any of the newer hospitals, for example, Virtua Hospital in Voorhees, New Jersey, is a relatively new one. And what has happened is that these new hospitals are putting a lot more money into aesthetics. So, for example, when my wife gave birth, we went to the Virtua, and the rooms, they have nice TVs, they have nice sleeping arrangements for the husband, nice artwork. Okay? The grounds are nice. And so they do all this because studies have shown that this is what patients are more responsive with. Okay? So, in general, that's how hospitals compete for patients. The second way they compete is for physicians. Going with the competing for patients part, a lot of places patients still do care about the quality. And so to get the best quality, to get accredited, to get good rankings, the hospitals will sometimes compete for physicians. So the way they do this is through recruitment. They try to pay more for them to come out, give them more money. Okay. Now, just as with health insurance and most other things in life, you get what you pay for. And so if that hospital has better doctors, all right, the hospital has to pay more for them to get them those better doctors there. And all that happens is that that trickles down into the patient fees. Right, so you're getting what you pay for. Another thing that's becoming common is when we talk about contracts is the third thing that hospitals compete for, which is managed care contracts. They will negotiate with the insurance companies to get better prices, to get better freedom, to get anywhere where they can get either in a network or get better prices for sending their patients there. They'll be competing for them. Because if you're in a network, a hospital is going to send, or an insurance company is going to send their patients to you, or try to. Whereas if you're not in the network, they'll send them somewhere else. So that's where there's a lot of competition. Now, when you measure competitive success, economists use what is called a survivor analysis. And this is to see what is successful. And the way they do that is they look at different business types and they figure out which ones survive over time. And they make the conclusion from that those are the types of businesses, or those are the arrangements that are the most profitable or the lowest cost. And so, for example, when you think about movie theaters have they used to be small theaters, so one screen to 2 or 3 or 4. And whereas the larger ones that we see today with 8, 10, 16, I believe the Lowe's in Cherry Hill has 32 or like 30 or something like that, a very high number. And a survivor analysis, let me step back. But what had happened over time is that those smaller theaters has become less and less and less of, whereas the larger theaters has become more and more. And so what a survivor analysis will do, it says, well, let's see, if you look over time, you see that the smaller theaters are getting fewer and fewer, whereas the larger ones, there's more and more. So because the larger ones are surviving while the smaller ones are not, that must mean that it's more cost effective with the larger and the smaller. Now how that applies here is that this type of analysis has shown that hospitals that have either fewer than 100 beds or greater than 500, so the very small and the very large, they tend to be inefficient because they don't last as long. Another thing that these analyses do is that they've shown that for-profit hospitals tend to be more successful than non-profit, because then you have the profit driving it, so they may be making different decisions, try to cut care more. And with all of this, if you look at the competitiveness of the market, the hospitals that survive are the ones who force efficiency and better services. Right. And to measure this competitiveness, a lot of times what is done is you look at hospitals per X population in an area. And so economists, policymakers, they will look and try to figure out how many hospitals are in a city with 2 million people. All right? And all right, so there's one hospital every 300,000. And with all that, that's how they really go through and try to measure that competitiveness.